Let's take a look at America's abandoned islands. North Brother Island in New York was first developed in 1885 as the site of Riverside Hospital, a quarantine facility for patients with contagious diseases like smallpox and tuberculosis. Isolated on the East River, the island was filled with red brick buildings, walkways, and a small dock. Notably, it housed Typhoid Mary, the first identified asymptomatic carrier of typhoid fever in the U.S. Today, the island is completely abandoned, with nature overtaking the crumbling ruins. Access is restricted, and it has become a sanctuary for birds, especially black-crowned night herons, which are rarely seen in the city. In the Central Pacific Ocean, Jarvis Island was claimed by the U.S. in 1858 for its guano deposits, a valuable source of fertilizer. Workers lived in temporary huts while they mined the island's white sandy surface. It was briefly reoccupied in the 1930s as part of a colonization project, with a few small buildings and a weather station added. Now Jarvis is uninhabited and part of a national wildlife refuge. The only signs of human activity are rusting equipment and the remains of the former settlements. Nomans land off the coast of Massachusetts was used by the U.S. Navy as a bombing range starting in 1943. The island once had farms and homes in the 19th century, but those were removed as military activity ramped up. For decades, fighter jets and bombers used it for target practice, leaving behind craters and unexploded ordnance. Today, it remains closed to the public due to safety concerns. Though no longer in active use, the island has become a wildlife preserve, attracting seabirds and seals. Just a few hours away, Swinburne Island in New York Harbor was built by landfill in the 1870s to quarantine immigrants showing signs of disease. It had dormitories, a crematorium, and medical wards. During World War II, it was repurposed for military training. After the war, the buildings fell into disrepair and were left behind. Now overgrown and inaccessible, the island is a nesting site for several bird species and serves no human purpose anymore. Howland Island, another isolated Pacific territory, was intended to be a stopover point for trans-Pacific flights in the 1930s. The U.S. built an airstrip and radio station there in anticipation of Amelia Earhart's round-the-world flight. She disappeared nearby in 1937. The island was later occupied by U.S. forces during World War II, but has remained uninhabited since. The airstrip is barely visible today, overrun by scrub and bird life. Back in New York, Hoffman Island was created in the 1870s and functioned as a quarantine station alongside Swinburne. Immigrants arriving with potential illnesses were detained there. During World War II, the island was used for training merchant marines. By the 1960s, it was abandoned. Now it is off-limits to visitors and primarily used as a protected area for nesting birds. Alaska's King Island was once home to a thriving Inupiat community, with homes built on stilts clinging to steep, rocky slopes. At its peak in the early 1900s, around 200 people lived there, subsisting on walrus hunting and fishing. The U.S. government closed the local school in the 1950s, forcing families to relocate. Since then, King Island has been uninhabited. The wooden houses remain, weather-beaten but still standing, perched silently above the Bering Sea. Also found in Alaska, Atu Island saw fierce fighting in World War II when Japanese forces occupied it in 1942. The U.S. retook the island in 1943 after a brutal battle. After the war, a Coast Guard station remained until the late 20th century. Now the buildings are deteriorating, and the island is empty of people. Its landscape is littered with rusted military debris, and it stands as one of the most remote and haunting sites in the country. Galoo Island in Lake Ontario, New York, was first settled in the early 1800s and once had a lighthouse, a schoolhouse, and private homes. The lighthouse keeper's residence was continuously occupied until the 1960s. In later years, it was used for seasonal hunting and fishing camps. Today, the island is largely deserted, with only the lighthouse and a few structures remaining. Plans to develop it into a wind farm were abandoned, leaving it to quietly deteriorate. The Thimble Islands in Connecticut is a cluster of tiny islets off Branford. It once hosted summer cottages and even small inns during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Some were inhabited year-round by fishermen and retirees. While a few of the islands are still privately owned and have maintained homes, many of the smaller ones are abandoned, their structures collapsing into the woods or into the sea. Boaters now pass by what were once bustling little communities, now ghostly and quiet. Florida is known to have plenty of islands, one of which is Ballast Key. It was developed as a private tropical retreat in the 1970s by American conservationist David Wolkowski. The island featured a main house and guest quarters surrounded by palm trees and white sand. Celebrities like Truman Capote and Tennessee Williams visited. After Wolkowski's death, the island was donated to the federal government. It is now uninhabited and part of the Key West National Wildlife Refuge, off-limits to visitors to protect local wildlife. Fort Carroll Island in Baltimore Harbor was constructed in 1858 as a sea fort designed by Robert E. Lee. It featured brick walls, gun emplacements, and military quarters. Although never used in battle, it served various minor roles through World War II. After being decommissioned, it passed into private hands. Today, the fort is in ruins, overgrown with vegetation and surrounded by decaying seawalls, a forgotten landmark in the harbor. Baker Island in the Central Pacific was claimed by the U.S. in 1857 for guano mining. Workers set up basic shelters, and the island was later part of the American Equatorial Islands colonization project. During World War II, it had a weather station and temporary military presence. Today it is deserted and designated as a national wildlife refuge, with abandoned equipment and structures slowly eroding under the sun. Pollepel Island in New York, home to the famous Bannerman's Castle, was used as a military surplus storage facility starting in 1901. The castle-like warehouse was built by Francis Bannerman VI and stored weapons and ammunition. A fire in 1969 and years of neglect left the structure in ruins. Now the island is occasionally open for guided tours, though the castle is off limits due to its instability. Maryland's Holland Island was once a thriving community of fishermen and farmers in the late 1800s. It had dozens of homes, a church, and a school. Due to erosion, the island began disappearing in the early 20th century. The last house collapsed in 2010, captured in a haunting photograph. Only marshland and a few wooden stumps remain today. David's Island in New York housed Fort Slocum, a military installation active from the Civil War through World War II. The island had barracks, training grounds, and even a prisoner of war camp. It was deactivated in 1965. Now the structures are crumbling and the site is overgrown, with efforts to preserve it stalled by funding and safety concerns. Let's quickly head back to the Pacific, where we'll find Johnston Atoll. This island served as a U.S. military base and nuclear testing site from the 1930s through the Cold War. It housed airstrips, laboratories, and storage for chemical weapons. After decades of service, the base was closed in 2004. Most of the infrastructure has been dismantled, and the island is now a remote wildlife refuge with restricted access. Hart Island in New York has been used as a potter's field since 1869, with over 1 million burials of unclaimed individuals. It also hosted a prison, tuberculosis hospital, and military training grounds over the years. It remained under Department of Correction control until recently. Now, it is being transferred to Parks Department oversight, with limited public access being developed. Dog Key Island, once known as the Isle of Caprice, was a popular Gulf Coast resort in the 1920s. The island had hotels, casinos, and dance halls, drawing crowds by boat. Hurricanes in the 1930s destroyed the buildings and reshaped the island's coastline. Now it's a sandy spit with no remaining structures, visited only by occasional boaters and birds. Navassa Island in the Caribbean was mined for guano beginning in the 1860s. It had workers' camps and shipping facilities. After the guano ran out, the island was largely forgotten. Today, it is uninhabited and managed as a wildlife refuge, with old mining ruins still visible among the brush. Adac Island in Alaska was built up as a major U.S. military base during World War II and the Cold War, with thousands of residents, schools, and housing complexes. After the Cold War ended, the base was closed in the 1990s. Much of the town remains intact but deserted, making it one of the largest ghost towns in America. Disney's Discovery Island in Florida opened in 1974 as a zoological park in Bay Lake, featuring exotic birds and animals in tropical settings. It closed in 1999, replaced by Disney's Animal Kingdom. The island has been left untouched since, with crumbling walkways, empty enclosures, and signs still hanging from the last day of operation. Ogluuga Island in the Aleutians was a World War II outpost with a small airfield and barracks. It was used for military transport and as a lookout. After the war, it was abandoned. Today, remnants of the airstrip and buildings remain, surrounded by tundra and wildlife, including large flocks of birds. Camp Hero in Montauk, New York, was originally a coastal defense station built in the 1940s. It included bunkers, radar towers, and troop facilities. Though some of the land is now a state park, much of the base remains sealed off, with conspiracy theories about secret experiments adding to its mystique. Gardiner's Point Island, just off the tip of Long Island, began as a military fort site in the 1890s. Known as Fort Tyler, it was supposed to protect the entrance to Long Island Sound. However, erosion quickly reduced the land and left the structure on a shrinking outcrop. The military gave up on it, and today the crumbling remains sit half submerged in water, often mistaken for a pile of rocks. Execution Rocks in Long Island Sound once housed a working lighthouse built in 1849. The rocky area had a grim past even before that. It was allegedly used during colonial times for public executions by chaining prisoners to the rocks at low tide. The lighthouse was automated in the 1970s, and the keeper's house was abandoned. Today, it still operates automatically, and restoration efforts have aimed to preserve the old structure, though it remains uninhabited. Shifting now toward the south, Cockspur Island in Georgia was once home to Fort Pulaski Key, completed in 1847. The fort played a role during the Civil War and later was used briefly by the U.S. military. The rest of the island had minor industrial activity, but was eventually vacated. Today, it's part of a national monument. Visitors can walk through the well-preserved brick fort, but the island outside it remains mostly untouched and quiet. Ship Island off the Mississippi Gulf Coast was once a critical port and military post. Fort Massachusetts was built there in the 1850s to guard against naval threats. The island had a small community and was even used by tourists in the early 20th century. However, hurricanes repeatedly split and battered the island. Today, Fort Massachusetts stands largely intact, but most of the island is undeveloped and accessible only by boat. Also off Mississippi, Round Island had a lighthouse built in 1833. It helped guide ships into the Pascagoula River, but was heavily damaged by multiple hurricanes. The lighthouse was abandoned and eventually collapsed in 2005 after Hurricane Katrina. Today, restoration efforts have rebuilt a replica of the lighthouse, but the island itself remains desolate and uninhabited. Turning toward lesser-known spots, Great Isaac Cay in the Bahamas lies about 20 miles from Bimini. The British built a lighthouse there in 1859. It was staffed for decades, but saw tragedy in 1969 when 2 lighthouse keepers vanished mysteriously during a storm. Since then, the lighthouse has operated automatically, and the small outbuildings are abandoned. Today, the island is empty, save for curious boaters and ghost stories. Turtle Island in Lake Erie once held a lighthouse built in 1831 to guide ships near the mouth of the Maumee River. Though it had a keeper's house and a signal light, the site was often damaged by storms. After a fire in the 1960s destroyed remaining structures, today it's split between Michigan and Ohio, and its ownership is privately held. What's left are scattered ruins and wildlife. No one lives there or maintains it. Rainford Island in Boston Harbor was once home to a quarantine hospital as early as 1737, later serving as a reform school and even a pauper's cemetery. It had various buildings and saw thousands of people over the centuries. By the 1930s, it was no longer in use and fell into disrepair. Today, only remnants of foundations and walls remain, and it's visited mainly by kayakers and historians looking to retrace its layered past. Hinchenbrook Island in Alaska was a critical navigation point in Prince William Sound. In 1910, a lighthouse was built on its southern tip to warn passing vessels of the rocky coastline. It was manned for decades, then automated in the late 20th century. Since then, the lighthouse keeper's station has been abandoned. The structure still functions automatically, but the island itself is empty, battered by wind, and isolated from any community.